therapy with the initial plan to follow up with surgical resection. But they may end up not doing the surgical resection because there's no evidence of the primary tumor left, which is a great thing, or the tumor has progressed, or the patient has complications. We had one case where a registrar sent in a question. The patient never came back. They scheduled like 3 opportunities for her to have surgery, and she just hadn't shown up. So, she was like, well, what do I do for YP? And I said, in this situation, you leave it blank because you have no resection of the primary tumor. Other times you'll have your neoadjuvant therapy, then you have a biopsy of the primary tumor, but there's no grade information. In that case, you would code a 9. Once again, if you have no resection of the primary tumor, you leave it blank. Then we go back to you have a situation of no biopsy of the primary tumor, and there's a resection of the primary tumor, but no grade information. So you would have a blank and a 9. Then we have a situation where you have a biopsy of the primary tumor, but there's no grade info. And then you have a resection, but there's no grade info, and they would both be 9. So this is a slide that Jim put together. It just shows you where you would code blanks and unknown, which will hopefully be a help to you. So going to the now 4 grade data items. Whoever thought we would go from 1 grade data item to 4? So grade clinical is coded based on the highest known grade during the clinical time frame. This is usually from a biopsy or an FNA. And remember, for bladder, this includes the TURB, and for prostate, this includes the TURP and a simple prostatectomy. And you do see those exceptions in some of the notes. Or it's any treatment such as surgical resection or neoadjuvant, and it's before any type of treatment that you have. Grade pathological is you code the highest known grade during the pathological time frame, usually the highest known grade after the primary tumor has been resected. Now, based on the question we just got, if a procedure does not qualify for surgical resection or a pathological T in our NIM, it's not going to qualify for a pathological grade. So once again, you have to make sure those two agree. For example, a simple prostatectomy is not going to qualify for pathological staging for AJCC. It has to be a radical, so obviously it would not qualify for a grade pathological. So for most sites, it's going to mean the entire tumor has been surgically excised, and you can do this through an excisional biopsy, or you can have a major surgery. And of course, the exceptions are documented in the notes for each slide. So this is a slide that Jim put together. So, Jim does a lot of training and he tries to come up with very creative slides. I'm not that creative, so it's nice to have people like Jim around. So this is just looking at clinical versus pathological grade. So you have your diagnosis, you have your workup, and then you have your surgery. So your clinical time frame is going to be your diagnosis and your workup. And that's when they decide, are we going to do surgery first? Are we going to do neoadjuvant first? Are we going to do nothing? So there's this little cloud there for you. The treatment decisions are made at that point. Then you have the surgery. So the surgery is included in the pathological time frame. And remember, surgery, pathological time frame includes the surgery, the diagnosis, and the workup. So you can use any information from the clinical time frame. And then you have your adjuvant therapy. So I see Colleen again. So do we have a question?
We have a question. Can you repeat and explain what you just said about the simple and radical prostatectomy and grade?
Yes. So the reason I brought that up is we got a question in cancer form. So, you learned a lot of stuff getting questions from cancer form, at least I do. We have received confirmation from AJCC that a simple prostatectomy does not qualify for pathological staging. It has to be a radical prostatectomy. Now, with the simple prostatectomy, that is usually done for BPH, benign prostatic hypertrophy. Have a hard time saying that word. If a patient has known prostate cancer and they decide to have a prostatectomy, they're going to do a radical prostatectomy. So the simple prostatectomy, the case we got in that was being questioned is they knew the patient had BPH. Prostate cancer was not suspected because the PSA was normal, the DRE was normal. So they went in thinking all this patient had was BPH, but they found a focus of prostate cancer. So simple prostatectomy does not qualify for pathological staging in AJCC, so it does not qualify for a grade path. So simple prostatectomy is always going to be clinical for staging and for grade. So now we're down to our next quiz, which patient presents with a lump in her left breast. A core biopsy of the breast was positive for ductal carcinoma, Nottingham, grade 3. So our grade clinical is a 3. Patient returns for a mastectomy. Pathological shows a 2 centimeter ductal carcinoma, Nottingham is grade 2. So what's your grade pathological? Well, if you follow the notes in grade pathological, which have been updated, it tells you that you take all the information for pathological from the clinical time frame plus the surgery. Well, in the clinical time frame, our grade was a 3, which is higher than the path. So you want to take the information from the clinical. So your grade pathological is a 3. And then, of course, the grade post-therapy, clin, and path are both blank because we don't have neoadjuvant therapy here. So what if you don't have a resection of the primary tumor? So during our clinical time frame, they do a diagnosis and they do a workup. Oops. You assign the clinical grade based on the histological information from the primary tumor collected before any treatment. So that's your biopsy or your FNA. If the patient does not have a definitive surgery, then the pathological grade is going to be 9 or unknown. So if they had their workup and they decided this patient is not a surgical candidate, or or the stage is so extensive that surgery just would not be, helpful, they just do chemotherapy and radiation. In other words, they do adjuvant therapy. They don't do neoadjuvant therapy, they just do adjuvant therapy. So that's when you would code your grade pathological as 9. So patient presents with a persistent cough. A CT showed a mass in the upper lobe left lung. A biopsy of the tumor in the left lung was positive for poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma. And the patient went on to have radiation and chemotherapy because they were not a surgical candidate. Now, obviously, we are in the lung schema, and you will see that the grades are defined by the historical definitions that have been used, which are the nuclear grades. So lung is a schema that continues to use the nuclear grade terminology for grade. So we have a poorly differentiated. So our grade would be 3 based on that, and our grade pathological would be 9. So grade post-therapy, this is after you've had your neoadjuvant therapy. So grade post-therapy clin is the highest known grade after neoadjuvant therapy, but before surgery of the primary tumor. So sometimes what they'll do is after the neoadjuvant therapy is completed, they'll go in and do a biopsy of the primary site, and that's what you're looking for. If they don't do a biopsy, you leave this blank. Grade post-therapy path is the highest known grade after neoadjuvant therapy and surgery to the primary tumor, usually resection or attempted resection of the primary tumor. So a lot of times what we're seeing is, they have their neoadjuvant therapy and then they just go straight to the surgical resection. And that's fine. Your grade YC would be blank in that situation. So now we're looking at post-therapy clinical versus pathological versus post-therapy pathological. So remember, we have our clinical time frame here. We have the diagnosis, we have the workup. They made their decision, we're going to do neoadjuvant treatment. So they do the neoadjuvant. So then you put across, then the information there stops. You cannot use any information from the diagnosis or the workup or the neoadjuvant therapy. Everything stops. And this is for AJCC staging as well. So then they go to the clinical workup after neoadjuvant therapy. This is your YC time frame where they may do some imaging, or they'll do a biopsy of the primary site, or maybe a suspected lymph node. They'll do additional workup, and then they'll go to surgery. So as you can see here, the YC and the YP act very much like the clinical and the path. For the grade post-therapy pathological time frame, you can use any information that was obtained during the clinical YC time frame. So it's the same concept that you've been looking at for clinical and path. Pop quiz 6, a patient presents with a primary rectal tumor, which you should know by now, if you've been around for a while, that usually neoadjuvant therapy is done as a first course of treatment for rectal tumors. So a core biopsy rectum was positive for poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma. Patient had their chemoradiation. And then after the neoadjuvant therapy, during the clinical post-therapy clinical workup, they had a residual tumor that was biopsied and showed moderately differentiated adenocarcinoma. Then they went on to do the post-therapy surgical resection, which was well-differentiated adenocarcinoma. So what are our grades? So our clinical grade is a 3 based on poorly differentiated. So here's another schema that goes based on nuclear grading. Our grade pathological is going to be 9 because we had no surgical resection prior to chemo or radiation. In other words, neoadjuvant therapy was done, so pathological grade is 9. Then this patient had, after the neoadjuvant therapy, had a biopsy which showed moderately differentiated adenocarcinoma, which is 2. And then the resection was done, which was positive for well-differentiated adenocarcinoma. Now remember, for YC and YP, you follow the same guidelines that you follow with clinical and pathological. If the clinical grade is higher than the pathological grade, you assign the clinical grade in the path grade field. So the same concept here. You have a moderately differentiated from clinical. Your path is well differentiated, so you go with the clinical since it's higher. So with all that, what are some of the 2021 updates? Yes, Colleen.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why don't we use 3 for both clinical and path like the other example?
Pop quiz 6, the question.
They did not say.
Okay, so whoever posted that question, could you clarify which cases you're comparing so I can make sure I give you the right answer? And we can come back to it. So just come in and tell me when they repost. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so if you have not looked at the version 2.0 grade manual yet, there are a lot of changes in it. And if you have looked at it, I hope it didn't overwhelm you too much. But we had a lot of new notes come in, basically for clarifications based on questions we get in cancer form. So those questions you post are very helpful to us. And Colleen's back. Yes.
Minor lung and breast case.
Okay, the lung and breast case. Okay, we're going to go backwards for it. Sorry about this. So here's the lung. No, that was the breast. Sorry. Oh gosh, I'm having problems here, aren't I? Let me see. This is going to be easier this way.
I promise I've been watching. It just popped up.
Oh, that's okay. No reason to apologize. Okay, so here was the lung case. We had poorly differentiated for the, so the grade clinical was a 3. I'm hoping that's the one. And then we have the rectal tumor, but the question, okay, so that's the lung one. Here's the breast. Okay, so in this one, the grade Nottingham was a grade 3, and the second one, they came in for the path was a 2, so you go to clinical, takes priority for a 3. So on this one for the lung, you do not have a surgical resection. So you cannot use the grade clinical 3 and the grade pathological because you did not have a surgical resection. So just remember that you have to have a surgical resection to fill in the grade pathological. If you don't, it's always going to be a 9.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope that answered her question or their question. Okay. Yes, I do have an extra screen. I have an additional screen on my laptop, so I have to swap it all the time. Okay, so back to our 2021 updates. Due to addition of new notes, our note numbers have changed, and we did not put this into the change log because it would have made the change log almost as long as the grade manual. So just a warning that note numbers have changed. So if you have memorized some of these notes, haha, I know y'all haven't memorized notes. Just keep in mind that note numbers have changed. Based on these changes that we put into 2021, for 2021, you do not have to go back and change any cases. You can apply it to 2018 forward, so you can apply it to your 2020 cases or any 2018 or 2019 that you find later on. But you do not have to go back and change anything. If you choose to do that, that's fine, but nobody is asking you to go back and look at cases you've already completed. So we have added grade post-therapy CLIN, which we talked a little bit about. It's applicable for cases 1/1/2021 and forward. However, you can use it for cases going back to 2018 forward if you want. Once again, you do not have to change any cases or go back and review any cases. It follows the same guidelines as all the other YC data items. So if you looking for guidelines on how YC is done, you need to go to AJCC or the STOR manual, which will explain to you about all the YC data items. Of course, if you have no neoadjuvant therapy, you leave it blank. And our grade post therapy is now called grade post therapy PATH or YP. So we have the YC and the YP. And for the YC, the requirements on the YC data items are it's only required when the patient has neoadjuvant therapy and they have a clinical workup and their surgery is canceled. So that's the only time it's required for the YC data items. You can fill it in for anything. I mean, you can fill it in for a patient had a biopsy, lung cancer. The only treatment recommended was chemo radiation. Then they did clinical follow-up after the therapy was done. You can use YC for that, but it's not required. So there's a lot of ways you could use YC, but go to the STOR manual to get the full instructions on when you apply YC. For all grade data items, we have a new note. If there are multiple tumors with different grades abstracted as one primary, you code the highest grade. And this has been confirmed with the cancer committee. Now, this is a little bit different than some of the instructions on some of the SSDIs. For example, ER, PR, and HER2 for breast. You want to go with the largest tumor to get your ER and PR results on. Whereas your smallest tumor could have the highest grade. So just remember, you want to go with the highest grade and do not confuse this with the SSDIs. Okay, so this is one of the new notes. Here comes Colleen.
All right, question. I know this is not an SSDI presentation, but hearing that grade is in line with AJCC neoadjuvant definition makes me question if this applies to the SSDIs as well. Do the SSDIs follow the definition as well?
Most of the SSDIs will have a note about neoadjuvant therapy. We're still trying to figure out all the neoadjuvant therapy, how it affects. But in general for SSDIs, if you have information prior to neoadjuvant therapy, that takes priority. However, if the only information you have is after neoadjuvant therapy, then you can use that. That's the general rule for the SSDIs. I hope that helps. Like for ER, PR, and HER2, there's a specific note in there about neoadjuvant therapy and what results you use. And there's a couple others that have specific notes, but the general rule is that you want results prior to neoadjuvant therapy, which are not always going to be available. And we understand that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I like this. I haven't had other states do it this way where somebody pops up when there's a question. So this is kind of nice. I like this. So we have new notes, and this was really developed because we were getting so many questions in and there was so much confusion that we did this for every single schema, and trust me, this was a labor of love getting the grade manual updated with all this. So the new note too, and this is in every schema, and this is why I say check your notes because they all shifted. There is a preferred grading system for this schema. And what that means is there is an AJCC defined grading system. This is when Nottingham takes priority or Gleason's takes priority, or even the nuclear grade system can take priority. If the clinical grade given, so we're in grade pathological, if the clinical grade given uses the preferred grading system, so example, let's say we have a breast case, they say it's the Nottingham grade 2, and the pathological grade does not use the preferred grading system using something like ModDiff, do not record the grade clinical and the grade pathological field. Assign grade pathological using the applicable generic grade codes, which are A through D. So here we have our example. We have a breast biopsy with a Nottingham grade 2. And then we have a lumpectomy, which in this case would qualify for pathological staging, invasive ductal carcinoma, nuclear grade 3. You would code your grade clinical 2 since the Nottingham is the preferred grading system. However, for the grade pathological, you would code it as a C for nuclear grade 2. Actually, I think that's supposed to be grade 3. Per the coding guidelines for generic grade categories. Now, this is what AJCC has been saying all along, and it took several of us, including myself and Jim, to really get this straight, that in this case, you know, you have the preferred grading system and you have the non-preferred grading system, and it would not be correct to code the Nottingham grade 2 in the pathological grade field because they are using a different definition. So that's why that note was implemented. And the same instruction can be used for YC and YP. And this is one of the things that's missing, that we discovered was missing after this grade webinar that Jim and I gave. So then you have the prostate. Once again, we have a preferred grading system. This is the Gleason. So example, biopsy of prostate's adenocarcinoma, Gleason patterns 2+3, and your score is 5. The surgical resection states a moderately differentiated adenocarcinoma. Moderately differentiated is not the terminology used for prostate grading. So in this case, your grade pathological would be a B, the moderately differentiated. You would not use the information from the clinical grade. This is like mixing apples and oranges. So then we have multiple schemas that have this note. These are schemas without A through D codes. These are the colons, the lungs, the ones that use the nuclear grade coding. So you have a biopsy of primary site shows a moderately differentiated adenocarcinoma. So remember, we're in the nuclear grading preferred system. The surgical resection states a high-grade adenocarcinoma, which is not part of the terminology of the nuclear grading system. So in this case, you would code grade clinical as 2, the moderately differentiated. But for grade pathological, you would have to code a 9 because you do not have the A through D codes in here because these schemas already use the nuclear grade system. So I know y'all are just like, what is she talking about? Here comes Colleen.
We're back at the SSDI thing. I'm still questioning if the definition for neoadjuvant therapy is the same for SSDI, or if a short course such as that given as bridge therapy would not be considered a neoadjuvant when coding the SSDIs.
Yes. If you determine you do not have neoadjuvant therapy for staging for grade, it's the same for SSDI. It's the same for everything and for that patient. It does not matter what data item you're looking at. So hopefully that will answer their question. You look confused, Colleen.
I'm trying to type it out. I might let you type that one out.
Okay. Back to grade. Okay. We have another updated note. And once again, this varies by schema, so I couldn't give you actual note number, but the ones I just went over are always number 2. Now we're looking at behavior. So the tumor behavior for the clinical, so we're still in grade path. We're still looking at situations where you can use the grade clinical and the grade path. The tumor behavior for the clinical and the pathological diagnosis are the same, and the clinical grade is the highest grade. Both are in situ or both are invasive. And this is pretty much what you're going to see most of the time. The tumor and the other situation is tumor behavior for the clinical diagnosis is invasive, and the tumor behavior for the pathological diagnosis is in situ. You would use the clinical grade. And AJCC follows this, that if you have an invasive followed by an in situ, your T component is brought down from the clinical. As a reminder, if the clinical diagnosis is in situ and the pathological diagnosis is invasive, you cannot use the grade clinical and the grade pathological because the behavior has gone from in situ to invasive. But if it goes from invasive to in situ, you can use the clinical grade in the path grade field. Once again, the same concept for YC and YP. Now we're down to surgical resection. So you can see there was a lot of notes added. Surgical resection is done of the primary tumor and there is no grade documented from the surgical resection. So if you have a grade from the biopsy, and your surgical resection has no grade documented, you can use the clinical grade. Or a surgical resection is done in the primary tumor, is no residual cancer. So once again, you would use the clinical grade in the path grade field. The last one is surgical resection of the primary tumor has not been done. but there is positive microscopic confirmation of distant metastasis during the clinical time frame. So we are really getting into AJCC coding guidelines here. So let's say you had a biopsy of the lung and it showed squamous cell carcinoma, and then they did a liver biopsy which was positive for metastatic carcinoma. In that case, you could use the clinical grade and the path grade field, just as you could use the clinical stage and the path stage field. That's following AJCC guidelines. Once again, you can apply the same thing to YC and YP, and here comes Colleen again.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
If biopsy is only in situ and then subsequent surgery is invasive, would clinical grade have to be 9 since you don't know the clinical grade of the invasive component, even if a nuclear grade is stated for the in situ component?
We are actually coming up to that because
Okay.
we're getting a lot of questions about that. That's an excellent question. I will answer it, but just hang on. We are seeing that a lot, actually. So back to our pathologically confirmed distant mets. So if during the clinical workup, so imaging, biopsy, you have pathologically confirmed distant mets, it does not change the clinical grade because you're still getting the grade from the primary tumor. If all you have is confirmation of distant mets, you have no information on the primary tumor, then your grade would be 9. So remember, you have to have grade information from the primary tumor and microscopic confirmation of distant mets. If that situation is met, there's no surgical resection, then you can use the clinical grade and the path grade field. So this was just another way that Jim put together this slide. We're back to pop quiz 7. Okay, I'm just going to skip over this because I can see I'm running out of time and I do want to get to some of the clarifications. One of my cats is attacking something over here. So if you hear anything in the background, that's just one of my cats. So some of the clarifications for brain, CNS, and other, which are the only schemas where you can get benign tumors, actually intracranial gland as well. For benign tumors only, that is, your behavior is a 0, code 1 for grade. Now we have edits being implemented in 2021 for 2021 cases forward. So none of your cases from 2018 to 2020 will be edited. But you always want to assign a code 1. It applies to all the histologies in the brain, CNS, other with a /0. This was confirmed by the Cancer Committee. This is in the notes. This is also in the cancer forum. For borderline tumors, so we asked about those two, /1. These can be either a 1 or 2, so there's no default for these tumors. So you would need to read the AJCC table in the brain chapter that gives you default grades for some of the histologies or the CAP guidelines. So we have put in this, I highlighted this in yellow because I wanted you all to see this note. So we got a question from somebody in Tennessee that said, can you print it? Can you include that table from the AJCC manual in the grade manual? And I said, no, we can't because that's has to do with publishing rights, stuff that I don't understand. And she was like, well, we don't do AJCC stage and we don't have the book, so how are we supposed to do grade? So we added this note in here that you can also use the CAP guidelines. So if you're in a facility that does not do AJCC staging and you don't have a book, you can use the CAP guidelines to get the default grades. And we also have some of these list of histologies and grades in the solid tumor rules. And for the most part, these 3 resources, AJCC book, the CAP guidelines, and the solid tumor rules, are in agreement. They don't, none of them disagree, but you know, AJCC may have one histology that the other two resources don't. We're still trying to get put together a default. When you have this primary site histology combination, here's your grade. We're trying to put together one of those things because we keep getting information about some default grades. For breast, we have a new note. Grade from nodal tissue. Remember I told you you couldn't use grade from nodal tissue. Well, here's an exception because you know there's always an exception to every rule. Grade from nodal tissue may be used only when there was never any evidence of the primary tumor. In other words, you have a T0. So grade would be coded using G1, G2, or G3, even if the grading is not strictly Nottingham. So if they say this is a well-differentiated tumor, you could assign a G1 and so forth. This does not apply to a tumor when there is evidence clinically and found to have no residual tumor on surgical resection. That is not the same thing. Clarification. In situ is cancer. If you have in situ, you have evidence of a primary tumor. So registrars are trying to use this rule when they have DCIS because some of them think this isn't cancer. DCIS is cancer and you cannot use it when that's all you have in the breast. So you still would not be able to use the information from the lymph nodes in this case. So y'all can get the quizzes later because I am running out of time. I haven't forgotten the registrar's question. I thought it was here. Don't worry, I'll answer your question. The generic grade table, when can you use it? The grade for the case is described using a generic description or term only, usually a nuclear grade, and the use of the preferred grading system for site was not documented. So if you're looking at a site-specific grade table and you have grade codes A, B, C, and D, then you can use the generic grade table. And you must meet all of the above criteria here. So here is what the generic grade table looks like. And for those of you who've been around for a while, may recognize this table as being in previous versions of the grade rules. And it is the same table. So you do not use this table for any priority AJCC preferred grading system terms. So, you know, if you have a Nottingham, you cannot come here and use it. You cannot use it to convert to grade 1, 2, 3. Even though we have that column in the middle, you do not use that to convert a moderately differentiated tumor to a Nottingham grade 2. That's not how you use the table. And when we update the grade manual, we're actually going to take that middle column out because it's causing confusion. And I can see why. So here are some examples of when you can use the generic grade table and when you cannot. So the first table we're looking at on the left is table 99, which is a generic grade table because it's for like the summary stage only chapters, like your trachea, your digestive other. And the only grade codes available are the nuclear grade or the generic grade categories.
What are you talking about?
Did we have a question? Okay. The table in the middle is from kidney, and not everything is here because we were running out of space, but you can see it has preferred codes 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember, the numerical codes take priority over everything else, but it also has the A, B, C, and D codes. So if you had a kidney that just said moderately differentiated or low grade, let's say low grade, you could go use the generic grade category, which would tell you a low grade is, I believe, either a 1 or 2. I don't remember right offhand, but you could use that, an A or a B. So you could use the generic grade category table for a low grade kidney because kidney has the A through D codes. Then we go over to table 1, on the very right side, and this is for multiple sites, some of the head and neck and some others. And this is a nuclear grade based coding table, grade table. But you cannot use the generic grade category table because it does not have the A through D codes. Now, why did we do that? Well, because if we had A through D in here, you would have G1 as well diff, you would have A as well diff, you would have G2 as moderately diff, you would have B as mod diff, and you were going, well, what's the difference? Which code do I use? And that's why we did not repeat it when the nuclear grading system is used. So here we have some other clarifications for ovary, fallopian tube, and primary peritoneum. We got clarification from the CAP Cancer Committee that if you have clear cell carcinomas, borderline epithelial neoplasms, okay, hold on. Immature teratomas and serous carcinomas use L and H, and these are the histologies that are under L and H. For example, 8461 by definition is a high-grade serous carcinoma. So I got a question from somebody who said, this histology is already a high grade. Why do we have to double code and code the grade as high as well? And I was like, unfortunately, that's just the way it is. 8460, I believe, is the low-grade serous carcinoma, so you would assign it L. This is one of the few schema grade tables where you have low-grade and high-grade are part of the definitions. Let's see. So we'll go through this pop quiz. So patient presents with abdominal left pelvic pain. The TAH-BSO performed revealing a high-grade serous carcinoma 8461/3. So your clinical would be 9 because we have no information on the clinical workup. Your grade pathological would be H because by definition, high-grade serous carcinoma is an H, so you would assign H. And what if the histology was clear cell carcinoma? So one thing I forgot to mention on the other slide is we have some histologies that you just don't grade. So once again, we have a grade clinical as 9. Our grade pathological would be 9 because those other histologies are not graded. So you would code 9. And remember, for grade, code 9 is a valid code. Do not be afraid to code that 9. I know people don't like coding unknowns, and we understand that, but sometimes it is appropriate. And we got some other clarifications on corpus uteri. So if you have serous carcinoma, clear cell carcinoma, undifferentiated, dedifferentiated carcinoma, carcinosarcomas, mixed mesothelial tumors, these are all high risk or high grade. So we have got clarification from the CAP Cancer Committee that these could always be a grade 3. So if you have a serous carcinoma, remember we're in the corpus schema, do not apply this to other schemas. But in the corpus schema, if you have any of these histologies, you always want to code it as a G3. I think edits, I'm not sure if edits have gotten in because we're still trying to determine all the eligible histologies. So we don't list anything by histologies on this because we haven't got a complete list yet. So here's pop quiz 10, which just clarifies that in this case, your pathological grade would be a 3 because you have a clear cell carcinoma. And remember that primary site does matter. The clear cell carcinoma is coded to 9 for ovary, fallopian tube, and primary peritoneal carcinomas, but for corpus, it is coded for 3. So different site, different rules. So do not apply this rule to other schemas. So here we go with site-specific grade breast. So codes 1 through 3 take priority. Those are the Nottingham grades, and they for invasive carcinomas only. Grades L, M, and H are for the in situ only. And then A, B, C, and D are for when the preferred grading system is not used. For example, they have a low grade on an invasive tumor. That's an example when you would go use the generic grade category. So here we have a pop quiz on breast. So we have an invasive ductal carcinoma, clinical time frame, Nottingham grade 2 to 3, and the surgical resection is a grade 2. So what is the clinical path and post-therapy grade? So grade clinical, oh, she didn't fill it in. So your grade clinical would be a 3, because when you have a G2 to a G3, you always take the higher grade. Your grade pathological would also be a 3, because your grade clinical is higher than your path. So here's an example where some of the notes that we just went over would come into play. So breast biopsy, invasive ductal carcinoma, you have Nottingham, a grade 2. Your surgical resection is an invasive ductal carcinoma or low grade. So what is the clinical path and post-therapy grade? So your clinical grade is code 2 based on the Nottingham 2. For pathological grade, you would have to code a B based on the low grade. So the breast table includes the A through D code. So you would use the generic coding grade table in this instance. And as a reminder, you cannot use the clinical grade for the pathological grade since the different grading systems were used. So that's some of the notes that we just went over. So we got a question in, we used a pathological grade for the clinical grade? No, you never used a path grade in the clinical grade. So in this case, the biopsy only showed DCIS, so you would not code, is this right? No. So this is a question we got on the, sorry, I'm having senior moments, and I'm not a senior yet, but I'm still getting my senior moments. So we had a case where the biopsy showed DCIS, and then the surgical resection showed invasive. So we're going from in situ to invasive. So for the in situ, you would, and I think this addresses the question that this registrar had. So if you have a biopsy that shows DCIS, you code the appropriate in situ grade on that. You code what you know during the clinical time frame. On a lumpectomy, it shows an invasive cancer. So at this time, you would change your behavior to a /3 because you now have a malignant tumor, and you would code grade 3 as 3 per the pathology report, which was a Nottingham grade 3. As a reminder, this does not negate the information collected clinically. You would not go back and change your clinical information. So yes, this does address the question of when you go from in situ to invasive. So remember that you're coding grade based on the information you know clinically. So in the situation where you have clinically in situ and pathologically invasive, during the clinical workup, you have an in situ tumor, so you code the grade accordingly. So it's very possible to have a clinical grade of H, pathological grade of 3, and your behavior is a 3. That's perfectly acceptable. I'm trying to watch the time here, and y'all will have these slides. Question on this. Breast biopsy, and I think I just went over this. High-grade DCIS. Lumpectomy is a microinvasive ductal carcinoma. What is the clinical path and post-therapy grade? So for the clinical grade, we have a high-grade DCIS, which would be an H. It is in situ. That's all we know during the clinical time frame. The pathological grade would be a code 9 grade not stated. Usually we found out when there's microinvasion that a lot of times you're not going to get a grade on microinvasion. So this is a situation where you would not use the clinical information in the pathological information, mostly because the clinical is in situ and the path is invasive. So once again, just wanted to reinforce this. Your clinical grade should not be 9 instead of H, because during the clinical workup, all you knew is that there was an in situ tumor. It does not negate the information in the clinical time frame. And I know this is a concept that a lot of registrars are going to have problems with. We already know this is going to happen. So here's a situation where we have an invasive ductal carcinoma as a grade 2, and the lumpectomy shows a low-grade DCIS. So now we're going from invasive to in situ. So your clinical grade would be code 2 based on the G2. Remember, we don't have Nottingham listed here or SBR, but if it's documented as a G2, you want to take that as the Nottingham. Your pathological grade would be a G2. Only in the situ component was found at surgery, but you know that this is an invasive tumor and you do have clinical grade information. So you would use the clinical grade in the pathological grade field. So one of the other things we have added to the grade manual, based on question we got in, actually there's been about 4 or 5 questions on consults. So you send the slides out for consult and it comes back and you have a different grade. So what do you do when you have your original pass report and then you have the consult? Well, the results from the consultation take priority. And this is what AJCC does. This apparently is in the SEER manual, should be documented in the STOR manual. The consult takes priority. And this applies to the SSDIs as well. This is actually in the SSDI manual and the general instructions. So here's the cancer form question, if you want to go look at it. And this rule applies to any site, but this example was prostate. So this is what we got in. So we had a Gleason score, the highest grade during the clinical workup was an 8. So that's a Gleason score 8 for grade group 4. Then elsewhere, the prostatectomy Gleason 3 + 4 = 7, grade 2, and their consultation review of original biopsies revealed that the Gleason score 7. So the original is saying 8, the consult is saying 7, so what do you record? You could record the 7 based on the consult. So the consultation result takes priority. Then your pathological grade, your clinical grade of 3 is higher than your prostatectomy grade of 2. So you would code the higher clinical grade in the pathological grade. I know some of you are just like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get all this straight. Yes, you are. You'll figure it out. I've had to figure it out. So this was all new to me as well. And everybody else on this is DI work group. So we're just a couple of steps ahead of you. So colon and rectum. Colon has a preferred 4-grade system listed here. A through D options are not included, so you cannot use the generic grade category table for colon and rectum. And updated note 2, this was the example where if you had a mod diff on biopsy and then a low grade on the surgical resection, you cannot use the clinical grade in the path grade field. You would have to use code B for the low grade. So here we have an example. So the patient had a rectal biopsy, poorly diff adenocarcinoma, had neoadjuvant chemoradiation followed by surgery. Then we have a surgery, which is minute focus adenocarcinoma well diff, was the clinical path and post-therapy grade. So for the clinical grade, you code 3, poorly diff on biopsy. That makes sense. Your pathological grade would be 9 because patient had neoadjuvant therapy, so you would not have a pathological grade. We have no information on the post-therapy clin, whether there was a workup or a biopsy, so we leave that one blank. And our grade post-therapy well diff on surgical resection would be a 1. Remember, in this case, you cannot use the clinical info in the post-therapy YC or YP grade. So your grade clinical is 3, but your grade post-therapy is 1, and that's fine. Just remember, you cannot bring that clinical grade down to the post-therapy grades. For bladder, we have grade is histology specific. So we have our low grade and our high grade in bladder. We saw this also in ovary. So urothelial cancers use low, high, and 9. If it's only stated as G1 through G3, you would code to a 9. The adenocarcinomas and squamous cell carcinomas use codes 1 through 3 and 9. And there is no A through D option for bladder, so you cannot use the generic table. So we do have an example here. So the TURB is a high-grade invasive papillary urothelial carcinoma. It is treated with neoadjuvant therapy followed by surgery. Remember, a TURB is a clinical workup only. It does not qualify for path staging or path grade. The post-therapy surgery is cystectomy. Residual high-grade focal urothelial carcinoma in situ, no residual invasive disease. So your clinical is code H, the high-grade invasive urothelial carcinoma. So path is code 9 because we have neoadjuvant therapy. Post-therapy, residual high-grade in situ urothelial cancer on resection after neoadjuvant therapy. So the clinical grade can never be used in the post-therapy grade field, but they happen to be the same grade. Even though the first one in clinical is invasive and the one in post-therapy is in situ, does not make a difference. Now, breast is the only one where there is a difference in situ and invasive grades. No other schema has that. Come on. Okay. So we got a question on this. We really confused a lot of registrars when we did the grade webinar. If we can't use clinical in the YP field and we cannot go back to in situ once invasive cancer is identified, how can YP be coded H as shown? You are mixing behaviors in this example. Yes, we are, but we also aren't. So remember, you're coding what is known at the time of what qualifies for whatever time frame you're looking at. So we are coding what was found on the post-therapy grade, which was in situ, high-grade papillary carcinoma in situ. This is the same thing that AJCC does, stating it's possible to have a YPTIS or even a YPT0 after neoadjuvant therapy when the original tumor was invasive. So if you're doing AJCC staging, just think in terms of how AJCC would do this. If you're not doing AJCC staging, it's going to be a little bit harder concept for you to grab a hold of, but it can be done. So for post-therapy, a case can be invasive during the clinical time frame and in situ during the post-therapy time frame. The grade is based solely on the information in the post-neoadjuvant therapy time frame. So this is another example where you are mixing behaviors and coding based on the behavior. So here's another grade table. This is the brain, CNS, other, and the intracranial glands. Remember, we went over the slide that for the /0 tumors, those are the benigns, that it would always be a WHO grade 1. Borderline brain tumors can be either grade 1 or 2, so you have to use the AJCC manual or the CAT cancer list or the solid tumors to determine if your histology has a default grade. So for the brain and CNS other, code the WHO grade documented in the medical record. If grade is not documented, review the WHO grading system tables. So determine if the histology has a default WHO grade. Then once again, here are your 3 resources, just reinforcing this is how you code the brain and CNS other. So here we have brain. We have an example. There's a 12 millimeter mass consistent with a benign meningioma. Treatment is active surveillance. So what is the clinical, pathological, and post-therapy grade? So your grade clinical would be 1 because this is a /0. This is benign. But remember, your grade pathological is also going to be 9. Just because this has a default grade does not mean that you can fill in grade pathological. You still have to meet the criteria for grade pathological, and we have not met that in this scenario. So no surgical resection. So we got a question on the webinar that said, I thought for brain tumors, if you had a default grade, you could fill it in for both the clinical and both the path. No, you can only fill in the path if there's a surgical resection. So here's another example, MRI, 5.1 centimeter cystic solid mass, left frontal lobe mass centered in corpus callosum. Left frontal craniotomy, excision of brain tumor, pathology, anaplastic oligodendroglioma, WHO grade 3. That's a tongue twister. Now, during our clinical workup here, we don't know what we're dealing with. We just know there's a cystic solid mass in the brain. We have no idea if it's benign. We have no idea if it's malignant. We don't know anything about it. So during the clinical time frame, we have no grade because we don't know what we're dealing with. After the surgical resection, we find out what we're dealing with, and it has a default grade of 3. You do not go back and change the grade clinical to a 3 because you did not know what you were dealing with in the clinical time frame. So even though this particular histology has a default grade, you still do not change your clinical grade based on the surgical findings. So do we have any other questions? I have a few minutes for questions. And there's Colleen.
Yeah. All right, so if there is a lobectomy without a biopsy, could the path grade be entered in the clinical grade?
No. If you have no biopsy, no clinical workup, you go straight to surgery, your clinical grade has to be 9. You cannot use path grade information in the clinical grade time frame. That's a no-no.
Using Pop Quiz 13, we're using a clinical grade of H for high-grade DCIS and for other primary sites. We don't use H for high-grade in situ like anal cancer, high-grade dysplasia, /AIN3, we code 9.
Okay, I got the 13. Now could you repeat the question?
Using Pop Quiz 13, we're using a clinical grade of H for high-grade DCIS. And for other primary sites, do we use H for high-grade in situ like anal cancer, high-grade dysplasia, /AIN3, we code 9.
You would code 9 in those circumstances. H is included in very few schemas. It's in breast, it's in corpus, it's in bladder. But if you do not have an H, you cannot code high grade that way. Usually high grade is going to translate to an A through D codes if those are available.
Okay. is SBR equivalent to Nottingham?
Yes, Scarf Gloom Richardson is what SBR stands for, and Nottingham is two different ways of saying the same thing. Just
All right, go ahead.
there are actually many different names, but SBR and Nottingham are the two most common, and it's the same thing.
Okie dokie. I don't, oh,
That's it.
oh yeah. Can we have access to the slides? Yes, the slides have, were mailed out this morning. Is that correct, Rhonda?
Last night.
Last night, okay.
If you have any questions about this presentation, post in the SSDI forum and just say, Georgia, presentation on grade, slide number 26, pop quiz 16, whatever. Just give me some clue what you're referring to, and I'll be glad to answer any further questions. So if you have any follow-up questions, just go to the SSDI forum, but you have to tell me what you're referring to.
All right.
Well, it looks like I finished right on time.
Yes, you did. Thank you, Jennifer. Really,
Thank you.
always enjoy having you. Even though-
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah, I fumbled over a few slides. I got through it, but y'all, if you haven't got the hang of grade yet, you're not alone. It was an extremely radical change. I mean, we did a total 180 on this. So if you're still struggling, it's okay. You have a lot of company, and post your questions in the answer form. That's what it's there for. And I'm the one that's answering them. Say, I'm a Georgia registrar, and me and I'll be on it like you don't know what.
We really appreciate you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. It was good to see you, Colleen and Robin, and hear Debbie. Didn't get to see Debbie, but I heard her.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye. Talk to y'all later.
Hello,
Bye,
Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, I just sent you a note in the chat if you can see it. I still live here in St. Simons, and I'm retired now, but I'm still active in Gatra.
Okay, Nancy was one of my colleagues at Southeast Georgia Health System. So
Oh, we're going to do the spin to see who wins today's prize.
Who's ready to see who wins today's door prize? Are we ready? Here we go.
Isn't this cute?
cool.
Katie Anderson.
Yay.
Congratulations. We'll be sending you through the email you provided to Gatra your Amazon $25 gift card. So thank you, everybody. It's been a wonderful day 2 second session. And thank you again, Jennifer. We miss you.
Bye. Miss y'all too.
Bye-bye.
We'll see everybody tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.